Haveringland Hall, Paradise Lost? Thank you for joining me for a talk about Haveringland Hall. I'm Nigel Boldrow, Project Manager for the major investment we've seen in St Peter's Church, Haveringland over the past year, including historical research and sharing our heritage through a range of channels, one of which is talks and displays like this. I'm going to try and give you an overview of how Haveringland has been the home of landed gentry for many centuries, with a particular focus on the last 200 years. We'll look at the building of the third and last hall using some of the records, its development and use in the later 19th and early 20th centuries, its uses in the Second World War, and also something of the Fellows family, the Lords de Ramsey, who have built and developed the halls. This picture is of the village sign with the third hall bottom right and the whole sign framed with the village stocks. Here's a relatively modern map to help you get orientated. Drawn before development of woodlands and the central lodge area of the modern lodge park, here's the church, the site of the final or third hall, and the moat of the earliest known hall. So to begin, let's look at medieval Haveringland. Records suggest that Haveringland has had a lord of the manor almost as far back as Roman times. Before the Norman conquest, Haveringland, as it was called, was under the lordship of Godwin, Earl of Kent, who was the father of King Harold. Soon after 1066, the lordship was in the family Guines, a family who probably took their name from the town of Guines near Calais in France. The Domesday Book in 1086 mentions manors at Haveringland, and the landscape appears to be well organised and extensively settled with 22 households. The Domesday description suggests agriculture, water meadows, and extensive tracts of woodland supporting 1,500 pigs. Around 1322, Sir Roger de Bilney was lord of the manor, and he built the north aisle of Haveringland Church, as well as a chantry, probably a chapel. We suspect the stone slab in the south transept of the church was originally covering his tomb in the north aisle of the older church. Aerial surveys have identified crop marks which suggest the sites of two deserted medieval villages, neither of which has been archaeologically investigated. The one to the northwest of the hall park might be what was called Alvington. The crop marks are located in what was called Alvington Field, though some sources say Alvington was located to the north of Corston. There are also crop marks located to the southeast of the hall of an unknown settlement. As some of you may know, the name of the village has been shown as Heverland, Haveringland, and other variations on maps in the following centuries. As I've said, the earliest known hall was built in the Middle Ages and lay to the north of the current lodge park. Whilst the house itself has long gone, its moat is still there and forms part of a glamping site. Here's a photo of part of the moat that remains. And of course the first hall remains. Well, not really. This is one of the glamping units on the site. As was pretty common, it may be that the original village to the west was moved when the hall was built. The first recorded owner of Haveringland Hall was Sir Thomas Hearne in 1580. The local population was around 100, and it remained sparsely populated throughout the following centuries and for much of the 20th century. The second hall at Haveringland was relatively small, built around 1710. The Haveringland estate map, dated 1777, shows the area owned by William Fellows, the owner of Haveringland Hall. St Peter's Church is shown to the south of the hall. The hall sits at the western end of an artificial canal which leads east to a large fishing lake. As you may know, these water features are still here. To the north of the hall, formal planned gardens are shown. The entrance to the hall was off the Haveringland Road, emerging at Crossroads where Stump Cross stands today. This was a crossroads with the cross standing in the centre. This extract from Faden's map of 1797 shows a larger area, and again the church, not very clear on this picture, was just to the east of some woodland. The hall at the end of the canal leading to the lakes. The location of this second hall was roughly at the bottom of the track that runs from the end of the church car park towards the lodge park at the bottom of the hill. The 1840 Corston tithe map gives a closer view, and as before, here are the church, hall, canal, and also the original moated site of the earlier hall. Finally, the 1830 Haveringland estate map gives more detail on the second hall. These show that the hall occupied one large plot of land, and it appears that the main access road is now shown going south to the crossroads at School Road and Clay Lane, where it's thought another cross called B Cross once stood. And here's a painting of the second hall with the church on the right before its rebuilding, kindly supplied by Desmond Tubby from the current Lord Poltimore, who's related to one of the occupants of the third hall in the early 20th century. As you can see, the second hall appears to be built of brick. William Henry Fellows was the owner of the second hall until his death in 1837. So what next? Let's focus on the third hall. Edward Fellows, a young army officer, inherited his father's estates in Ramsey, Cambridgeshire and Haveringland in 1837, aged just 28. He also succeeded his father in becoming MP for Huntingdonshire. These estates were very extensive, around 16,000 acres of rich Cambridgeshire fenland and 4,000 acres of lighter land in Norfolk. Edward had two brothers, and through their inheritance and good marriages were known as the Lucky Fellows. Get the joke? When he died in 1837, Edward's father also left a massive £130,854 in government stock and Pennsylvanian bonds, to be shared by his widow and three other children, worth roughly £13 million in today's money. The estate and personal effects were left to Edward. Edward married the Honourable Mary Julia Mills, daughter of George Mills, 4th Baron Sondes. Edward built the third hall between 1839 and 1843. It was designed by the famous architect Edward Blore, who was also the designer of the current Buckingham Palace. Around the start of the build, Blore produced a coloured visualisation of the hall seen from the southwest, overlooking the lake. And here's another painting courtesy of Lord Poltimore, showing the third hall on the right with the old hall to the left. Set in a rolling parkland with grazing sheep and the lake to the front, the location of the third hall perhaps reflects changing tastes in the setting of such country houses. A location at the top of a hill, compared to the old hall down in a dip near the canal, gave a more impressive view for those arriving, helped by a more scenic entrance road from the south, and its main orientation towards the south and the lakes was also characteristic of trends in the setting of such houses. Built on the hill to the north of the lake, the new hall would have 3 stories plus a basement. There were corner attics and an observatory tower which was added to the east wing in the 1850s. It also shows a service wing to the east, which was proposed in 1860 but not built. The drawing shows an illustration of the future coach house and stable block, shown here with its entrance to the north. The new Haveringland Hall will be faced on the 3 main fronts in Bath stone. There will be 40 bedrooms. The main entrance was on the west side. It was designed in the Italianate style, which drew inspiration from the rambling, asymmetrical farmhouses and villas of Italy. The style had become popular in the 1830s. At Osborne House on the Isle of Wight, built for Queen Victoria and Prince Albert in the late 1840s, is another example. The style became very popular later in the century in other countries, especially the USA, but it declined in Britain. The coach house and stable block were eventually built with an entrance on the west side. This is its front elevation. The clock tower entrance has a working clock like those at Buckingham Palace, and is thought to be the only other example of its kind. The south and east fronts of the hall, as seen here, and here, overlooked terraces and had views of the lakes. The east side had a museum containing a fine collection of fossils, shells, birds and other curiosities arranged by the Honourable Mrs. Fellows. The old landscape gardens to the south were demolished along with the old hall in 1842. This had been used to house some of the workforce for the third hall. An ice house in the parkland southeast of the hall was probably built around this time. Used, as the name suggests, for storing ice, ice houses were typically built underground or partially underground to keep food and drinks chilled throughout the year. They were crucial before the invention of refrigerators and freezers, allowing for food preservation and chilled beverages. A new entrance to the estate with lodges each side was also created to the west. The new hall was eventually surrounded by elaborate parkland gardens, which also included the village cricket pitch. Great Wood, to the northeast of the hall, had many trees felled during the war, since replaced by the Forestry Commission with fir trees. It is reputed to have had over 140 acres of lilies of the valley growing beneath the trees, a popular flower-picking destination for villagers who were chased away by gamekeepers concerned that the villagers would disturb the pheasants. Here are a couple of images of the main entrance to the hall. The main entrance to the park was located at B Cross, the crossroads where School Road and Clay Lane meet Haveringland and Norwich roads. As you can see, a lodge and also the village post office were here too. The magnificent wrought iron gates bearing Lord de Ramsay's crest were eventually sold off in 1951 to Hymers College, an independent school in Hull. Here's a relatively modern picture of them with a close-up of the college crest, where probably once hung the Fellows family coat of arms, shown here. I'd now like to spend a few minutes going a little deeper into the building of the third hall, as it is said to have some of the most complete sets of records for any new country house project. Edward Fellows seems to have been an energetic and decisive builder. Upon his succession in 1837, he summoned architect Edward Blore to Ramsay to carry out major changes both inside and out. Soon after, discussion began about Haveringland Hall, and in 1838 Blore sent some rough drawings of the new Haveringland Hall to Fellows. Blore had a reputation for being able to deliver well-built houses and to cost. Haveringland's Italianate style was unusual for Blore. Even more unusual for Norfolk, the three main elevations were to be faced in Bath stone. For what was essentially their second home, used mainly for shooting parties, this was an expensive project. Built in just under 4 years, the foundations were dug in spring 1839. The house and stables cost £21,000 and a further £16,000 was spent on furnishings and fittings. This total of around £37,000 is equivalent to nearly £5 million today. Alterations to the garden, often seen as a priority when building new country houses, were left until the main house was completed. So it was almost a decade until a conservatory, summer house or museum, a vinery, terrace and balustrade and the new grand set of park gates were erected. An additional chamber story was added to the east wing and a balancing observatory tower at the northern end, costing a further £36,000 or just under a further £4.5 million today. Similar amounts were spent in the following 30 years, including creation of a billiard room and its own gasworks. The Clerk of Works, Richard Armstrong, was extremely efficient, and with Blore paying frequent site visits and accounts being passed regularly to Fellows, Haveringland represents an example of best practice country house building. When the building was complete, Armstrong was rewarded with a gratuity of £50, equal to 16 weeks' salary. This gratuity was around £5,000 in today's money. Let's look at the workforce. Here's an example of some Victorian construction workers. Haveringland Hall was the last house of any size to be built before the railway reached Norwich and transformed the movement of men and materials. It was also built at a time of acute economic depression, so labour was relatively plentiful and cheap. And with the Clerk of Works intent on keeping costs down, The project cost somewhat less than comparable houses. A total of 249 different men were employed, most of them for short periods. Only 32 were on site for more than half the building period, and 114 were there for less than 10% of the time. In total, some 64,000 man-hours were used over just under 4 years. The total on site in the first year peaked at 87, with lower totals in the following 3 years. So as you can see, much of the labour was casual. Wages, salaries, expenses and commissions accounted for just over half of the total costs, with wages alone accounting for over 40% of total costs. Reports confirmed that the number of man days required to build the hall was considerably less than a comparable project at Henham Hall in Suffolk, completed some 50 years earlier. Armstrong eventually became an architect and was the designer of the church rebuild in 1858, along with further development of the hall. This was a time when the way large building projects were organised was changing, from where the clerk of works was responsible for organising a largely subcontracted workforce, the approach taken to the initial third hall build, to one where there was an increase in the number of building companies employing a range of skilled workers and a competitive tendering process. What about the building materials? Armstrong travelled to Bath at the start of the project to arrange the supply of Bath stone. This artist's impression conveys the scale and hard work involved in mining the stone. Over 1,000 tonnes were shipped to Great Yarmouth in 9 consignments, and these were then transported to Norwich on wherries, with the final 12 miles to the site by horse-drawn wagons. As a result, the final cost of the stone was over £2 per tonne, which was more than double the basic cost of the material. Baltic timber was also imported, shipped to Great Yarmouth, from where it was transported by wherry to Norwich, such as this one shown moored in Norwich. Again, the final distance to the building site involved using wagons and horses. The total cost of this timber was nearly £2,500, with a further supply of timber from the park worth just under £700. The total timber costs were around £350,000 in today's money. Bricks were often made on site using brick earth from the area, hand moulded by a largely seasonal labour force of brickmakers. Here's a colourful artist's impression of one such group. And then the bricks were fired in kilns such as this one. Brickmakers had a poor reputation, with absenteeism and heavy drinking seen as typical. The Haveringland clerk of works said of one brickmaker, quote, "The man appears to be quite honest, but fit for anything but a brickyard." Armstrong was unhappy with the first set or clamp of bricks this man produced, and after his 9th attempt he was fired. Armstrong then supervised the brickmaking more closely. In total, about 1,800,000 bricks were produced over 4 seasons, with around 100,000 in each clamp. About 10% were poor quality and were rejected from each firing. As you may have gathered, the hall and associated estate was developed over much of the second half of the 1800s. Edward served as an MP for 43 years, until 1880. He was created the first Baron de Ramsay in 1887, a title he enjoyed for only 1 month until his death at the age of 79. I think it's fair to say that the hall's climax was around this time and into the first decade of the 20th century. The ultimate layout can be seen in this Ordnance Survey map of 1885. Just look at the number of trees along Norwich Road, around the church and estate generally. Here's a closer view showing the hall, the coach house and stable block, and walled garden with the moat of the first hall to the north. So, what was life like in the hall in the early 20th century? Shown here are the second Baron de Ramsay, William Henry Fellows, and his wife, Lady Rosamond Jane Frances Spencer Churchill, the daughter of John Churchill, 7th Duke of Marlborough, shown in 1877. Therefore, William was the brother-in-law of Lord Randolph Churchill, and the uncle through marriage of Winston Churchill. Inheriting Haveringland Hall in 1887, William and Rosamond also had a London home in Grosvenor Square. They usually spent the summers at Ramsey Abbey and the winters at Haveringland Hall. When they arrived at Haveringland or returned to Ramsey Abbey, the whole family travelled with their staff and much of their equipment. Try to picture long processions of horse-drawn vehicles between Haveringland Hall and Attlebridge Station. Around the turn of the century, visitors to the hall, mainly for shooting parties, rather like this one, included several lords and ladies, the Grand Duke of Russia and Prince Francis of Teck in Germany, who was the younger brother of the British Queen Mary of Teck, wife of King George V. This is how Francis was shown in the magazine Vanity Fair. He seems to have been a rather lively character. He was expelled from Wellington College, Berkshire, quote, for throwing his housemaster over a hedge to win a bet. And all through his life he was an incorrigible gambler. The Baron and Baroness Cederstrom, shown here on their wedding day, were also frequent visitors. Adelina Patti, a then famous Italian opera singer, became Baroness Cederstrom in 1899 on her marriage to Baron Rolf Cederstrom, a handsome Swedish aristocrat who was many years her junior. After Patti's death, the Baron married this lady, Hermione Fellows, at St Peter's Church. This is a photo of Hermione in 1909. The Baron, Baroness and their only daughter Brita lived at Haveringland Hall until just before the First World War. Brita was the mother of the current Lord Poltimore, who I mentioned kindly sent us photos of the paintings of the hall and church. The parkland, accessed through those ornate wrought iron gates and along a stately tree-lined avenue from the main road, was a peaceful place with its arboretum, lakes and woodland. The Great Lake was home to moorhen, coot, great-crested grebe and rarer birds. It was renowned for its fishing. In 1910 the hall hosted the 7th annual show of the North Norfolk Horticulture and Poultry Association, which had competitions for fruit, flowers, vegetables, poultry and bread making, along with sports organised by Haveringland's vicar, the Reverend Peace, and other attractions including the Corston Brass Band. Around 4,000 people attended. The Haveringland Hall estate was huge and employed many staff, I'm guessing rather like this lot, and apparently 40 of his staff attended church each Sunday. These staff included tenant farmers, agricultural labourers, gardeners and gamekeepers. As you can see from this list from 1912, which also illustrates the extent of the estate, including nearby farms and properties. John Howe, farmer. Edward King, the estate carpenter and assistant overseer. Elijah Medlar, farmer, Quaker's Farm. Walter Parfitt, farmer, Larter's Farm. Aubrey Radway, land agent to Lord de Ramsey. George Robinson, farmer, Abbey Farm. James Savage, head gamekeeper to Lord de Ramsey. H. A. Terry, head gardener to Lord de Ramsey. Edward Wilkerson, farmer. William Wilkerson, King's Head Public House. Due to his eyesight problems, in 1914 William Fellows went to Germany to consult an eye specialist, accompanied by his son Reginald. Both were interned at the outset of the war. He was held for 15 months, during which time his eyesight got worse, and he eventually lost his sight. There are many stories about the blind Lord de Ramsey. He was often led to his favourite seat in the Carnation House. Lady Rosamond died in December 1920 at Haveringland Hall. Her remains were taken by a special train from Corston to Ramsey for burial at the family seat. Lord de Ramsey survived her by 5 years and died in May 1925, aged 76. The memorial plaque to William, which you can see in the south transept of the church, bears a very poignant biblical text, quote, "I was blind, now I see." There's also a memorial plaque to Rosamond in the south transept. When William died, his grandson and heir to the estate, the 3rd Baron de Ramsay Aylwin Edward Fellows, was aged just 15, so lived in Ramsay Abbey, and Haveringland Hall was mostly unoccupied. Here's a photo of him in later years. When Aylwin came of age in 1931, the trustees of the de Ramsay estate decided to vacate both Haveringland Hall and Ramsay Abbey, and a new family seat was established in Abbots Ripton Hall. Aylwin fought in World War II and was a battery captain in the Royal Artillery when the regiment was captured at the fall of Singapore. He remained a prisoner of war held by the Japanese for the rest of the war. You may wonder about the name Aylwin. Well, it's used extensively in the Fellows family and is actually the name of the founder of Ramsay Abbey, Aylwin Ramsay, the former home of the Fellows family and their baronial seat. So what of the Hall during the Second World War? Well, the Hall was requisitioned by the government, and in 1940 the 288th Field Company of the Royal Engineers were stationed here, mostly territorials from Norwich, Thetford and Brandon. This photo was taken at Haveringland Hall in September 1940, short before the Royal Engineers were shipped abroad. The company went to Singapore, where many, like Aylwin, were captured by the Japanese. A well-known local historian, Jack Kett, wrote about their stay here, quote, "The men entered happily into village life and many friendships were formed, as I learned a few years ago from a former officer of the unit at the Hall. When the time came for them to leave Cawston, instructions were given for the move to be top secret. Accordingly, they left Haveringland for the last time late at night to entrain at Cawston railway station. When they arrived there, they found about half the village waiting to wish them Godspeed. So much for the posters telling us that walls have ears and be like dad, keep mum." From December 1941 until December 1942, another company was stationed at Haveringland Hall. Engineer Sid Shorten describes the area as, quote, "a tiny hamlet of 4 or 5 cottages and the large hall with extensive grounds and a big lake, 2 miles on the Norwich side of Cawston and 8 miles from the city. 1 bus each weekday past the lodge gate, which was at the end of a very long drive." He continues, "A daily truck was laid on into the city, and once we were settled in, it was announced that married personnel with homes in the area could have sleeping out passes. My sister Helen's house was empty on Magpie Road, so I quickly made arrangements to take it over. So within a week or 2, Jean arrived, and we set up our first home." Here's a picture of Jean, Sid's wife. Sid goes on to tell a tale that rings true today with pretty much non-existent public transport services in the area. He says, quote, "The daily truck was no use with the sleeping out pass, so once again my bike came to play. With working in the kitchens it was shift work, early morning till after the midday meal for one, and then afternoon till supper the next week, so the bicycle meant I could get home every day. During this year in Norfolk, my cyclometer registered 4,800 miles. In July, the company went off on a 4-week manoeuvre. I was left behind to cook for the rear party of 16 who were to keep the camp in good shape. I arranged for Jean to come over on the Saturday morning bus with the idea of her getting the afternoon bus back, and I'd follow her later after doing the teas. She had a meal and met some of the men she'd known from the paper shop days at Prudhoe. We made our way down to the lodge gate in time to see the only bus disappearing down the road. The only alternative was to get my bike when I had done the tea, and with Jean on the crossbar we set off. It was hard going for both of us. She was about 10.5 stone at that time. The road was fairly flat apart from 2 places where we were glad to walk for a while." In 1942, Haveringland Hall saw construction of RAF Swannington commence. The contract to build the airfield was worth over £880,000 and brought with it new sounds and completely changed the local landscape, removing or realigning roads and creating new structures. By early 1944 there was accommodation for over 2,000 airmen and members of the Women's Auxiliary Air Force, or WAFs. The hall was used as officers' quarters and other buildings and structures were erected. Here's an image of the northern part of the airfield showing Haveringland Hall from the air as a group of, I think, Liberator bombers flew over. you can possibly see some of the buildings surrounding the hall. And here's an outline plan to give you an idea of the layout. You can see the church, the hall, and the area for WAF accommodation, later to become Lakeside Residential Park. And over here, what is fast becoming a light industrial estate where once a horticultural wholesaler was based. You can view this diagram in more detail on the heritage board near the car park. Squadrons of the RAF 100 Bomber Support Group were based here for just under 2 years. They were involved in night fighting and supporting bombing raids across Germany, using some of the earliest electronic warfare equipment to confound and destroy the enemy, as their motto states. If you want to find out more about the group, you can see a recent talk I gave on YouTube, and the website Haveringland Chronicles and the interactive heritage hub at the rear of the church also have more information. Victory in Europe came in May 1945, and local Jesse Underwood in Haveringland Through the Ages says, quote, "Victory was celebrated with a great bonfire, built of tree trunks and set blazing with flares and incendiary bombs." Tentative plans to retain and upgrade the airfield for post-war RAF operational fighter use came to nothing. So at an auction in November 1946 at the Royal Hotel in Norwich, the estate of 4,288 acres was sold off in lots. The sale catalogue described the hall as a, quote, "splendid mansion containing 40 bed and dressing rooms, 6 bathrooms, 2 halls, 6 reception rooms, extensive domestic offices, garages and stables, a chauffeur's flat, 2 cottages, 2 lodges, kitchen gardens, a magnificent lake, parkland and woodland of 131 acres, 15 capital arable farms of 18 to 406 acres, numerous small holdings, accommodation land and sites, 79 attractive cottages and houses, 2 fully licensed premises, the King's Head and Marsham Arms, several acres of common land and young plantations, and valuable lots of standing timber." Pause for breath. The tenants were invited to a meeting at the King's Head with the estate solicitors to discuss if they wished to purchase their respective holdings privately before the auction. So I think you can tell at this point in 1946 the Haveringland Hall estate had come to cover pretty much all of modern-day Haveringland Parish, as well as some adjacent areas. Whilst much of the former airfield is now private land and used for agriculture, some of the former RAF buildings were used for building cars, and the airfield was even used to trial a special helicopter. The hall having been demolished in 1953, much of it began its current use as a lodge park. Portions of runway and peripheral roads are still around, like those just outside the church. Here's a recent aerial shot of the estate showing its core development as a lodge park, surrounded by woodland and grazing fields. Today, only the foundations and cellars of the third hall survive, as shown here. In the ground you can still find the ice house, the 2 lakes and several trees in what was the Arboretum. The stable block, coach house and clock tower remain and are Grade 2 listed buildings. The 2 lodge cottages either side of the west entrance also survive, as does the wall around what was once the walled garden. Until relatively recently, the remains of a squash court could be seen, a remnant of the airfield since demolished. Apparently squash courts were a common feature at several RAF airfields. And we mustn't forget 2 other buildings with very close ties to the estate and the first Baron's family. First, the school, built under the patronage of the Honourable Mrs. Fellows, shown here in the 1920s when it had space for up to 50 pupils, and as it is today, a private residence. And finally, of course, St. Peter's Church. Apart from the tower and some of the north aisle, the building was recreated in Victorian Gothic style by the Fellows in 1858. The south transept was where the Fellows family sat, and as I've already mentioned, it has 2 brass memorial plaques as well as carved pew ends with the lion's head from their coat of arms. And there used to be a stove nearby too, so at least some folk were warm. What are the Fellows family in modern times? The Fellows are known for their connection to both the British landed gentry and the royal family. On the left is Robert Fellows. He had a career in royal service, including his role as the Queen's private secretary. He was married to Lady Jane Spencer, sister of Diana, Princess of Wales. Well-known playwright Julian Fellows is on the right. His family history, particularly his mother's challenging experiences with his father's relatives, influenced his interest in class hierarchies, which he explored in his dramas such as Downton Abbey and Gosford Park. John Aylwin Fellows in the centre, the current Baron de Ramsay, succeeded in 1993. He's married and has 4 children. The family continue to live at Abbots Ripton Hall in Huntingdonshire. He's maintained the Fellows' interest in the countryside, serving on local and national bodies associated with agriculture, drainage, plant science and the environment. He was the first chairman of the Environment Agency, was awarded the honorary degree of Doctor of Science by Cranfield University, and is also a former president of the Royal Agricultural Society of England. Well, that concludes my tour of Haveringland Hall and the Fellows family and others involved in it. I'm indebted to our local historian Lorna Wilson for her fantastic research and documentation of our local heritage. You can find out more on the website Haveringland Chronicles and the Heritage Hub at the back of the church, and we have 3 heritage boards around the village with some of this information. I'm also grateful to National Lottery players, the National Lottery Heritage Fund and other funders for their support for our project that's seen over £500,000 invested over the last year. And much of the material about the 3rd Paul's building has come from a book called Creating Paradise, the building of the English country house 1660 to 1880. Reflecting on what I've spoken about, it seems to me that Haveringland Hall and the Fellows family, especially in that period at the turn of the 19th and 20th centuries, provided a unifying focus for the whole of the village of Haveringland. In fact, the village was an estate village. Though times are very different then, and this unity came about through ownership, class and service, it seems to me that this was probably a period when the village had a sense of togetherness that over subsequent years was lost. Hence my title for this talk and the question it poses: Paradise Lost? And I mean not so much for the Fellows family, who probably managed to find another paradise in Huntingdonshire, but rather the local community. The buildings and facilities provided through massive private investments are certainly no more, and perhaps, coupled with the generally dispersed layout of the parish, the sense of village identity and togetherness has also diminished over the years. This is something the group Haveringland Together is trying to address through our pilot programme of events and activities, focused on this building being a community hub as well as church with just 6 services a year. Having said this, those of you currently living or holidaying on the site of the former hall, not to ignore issues of site services in terms of occupancy, you may feel that you've inherited some sort of paradise. It is certainly a lovely place to get close to nature in so many ways, as we've been discovering in our recent nature connection sessions. I'll leave you to judge whether paradise has been lost. Thank you.